Hi, everybody. Welcome to English Digest. I'm Tom.
Hi, I'm Stephanie.
And today we're talking about clothing and fashion. And this should be a subject of great interest to most of our students out there, especially the women, because you all want to buy clothes that make you look your best. Now, guys do too sometimes, but it's mostly a girl thing.
Yeah.
But now we're talking about something called second-hand clothing, which seems to be quite popular these days because if you buy a garment that is kind of out of style and then you wear it, hey, you might stand out and people will say, hey, wow, where did you get that dress? It looks cool.
Well, there's a secondhand clothing store in my neighborhood, but they sell designer labels.
Wow.
Which, if you were to pay full price, you'd be paying thousands of US dollars. It's kind of crazy. I don't know how people can spend that much money on clothes, but I've never even walked in because some of the designer label clothes, they look like old lady clothes to me.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? Like the Chanel jacket, which is still very popular. But anyway, yeah, the secondhand clothing that we're talking about today isn't necessarily designer labels. It's just regular clothing you might buy at a mall and what people do to get this secondhand clothing ready to resell to people. It's recycled, of course. We're going to start as we always do, guys, by reading through today's article. It's our all-English unit today, so we're going to try to speak a little bit more slowly, use more examples perhaps, and hopefully you'll understand everything because there's no Chinese teacher. So listen up. We're going to read through it now. Opting for second-hand clothing over new items has become increasingly popular as it offers economical wardrobe options and reduces waste. This trend is highlighted by startling statistics. The global market value of second-hand clothing surged to around 5.3 trillion NT dollars in 2022 and is projected to double by 2027. Despite its potential growth, this booming sector confronts distinct challenges in some countries. In the UK, many second-hand clothing businesses struggle to turn a profit. This paradox stems from the excessive supply of garments in the market and the high operational costs associated with processing received items. The abundance of cheap, fast fashion items has led to a cycle where clothing is not taken seriously enough and is discarded quickly with only minimal use before ending up in poor condition at second-hand stores. To sort and repair recycled garments means extensive manual labor, which is costly in the UK. In some cases, high labor costs cause the price of second-hand clothing to exceed that of new products. Some developing countries, such as Uganda and Indonesia, face both positives and negatives in the second-hand clothing trade. In the first place, not only does it generate employment in retail and transportation, but it also caters to the basic clothing needs of the economically disadvantaged. It's estimated that about 1/3 of Uganda's population depends on these affordable alternatives. Nevertheless, this trade also hampers the growth of local textile industries, leading to government proposals in both Uganda and Indonesia to ban imports of used clothing. While second-hand garments from domestic sources remain allowed, these legislative efforts have been met with strong opposition and challenges in implementation. These examples illustrate that easy access to second-hand clothing can sometimes have complex effects on a society and its economy. While used clothing might seem like an obvious solution to excessive garment waste, the reality is that it's a complicated issue that requires careful thought.
Okay, it's time for us to discuss the contents of today's lesson. The title is Reassessing the Second-Hand Clothing Trade. Now, if you reassess something, that means you kind of re-examine something. You look at it a second or third time. And we've got the second-hand clothing trade, which is business done with used clothing, basically. And we need to take a second look at it. For the most part, on the surface, it sounds like a good idea. Selling used clothing can be good for the environment. We don't have to make more clothing and things like that. But some people have suggested that there might be a problem with secondhand clothing. So we need to look at it again. We need to have a second look. We need to reassess the issue.
Yeah, look at something a little bit more. Maybe you'd made an assessment, judgment call on something before, and then, you had new information come or the situation changed, so you needed to reassess something. Maybe you're a manager and you have employees, and when you first hired someone, you thought, oh, that person's really great, they're a hard worker, and then things changed, and that employee just became kind of sloppy, would show up late to work. You might need to reassess how you feel about that employee. So reassess is a really great word to learn.
Okay, so let's move right into the article here. It says here in the first paragraph, opting for secondhand clothing over new items has become increasingly popular. So you opt for secondhand clothing, you choose secondhand clothing, and you choose it over new items. You're comparing the two, so you're choosing secondhand clothing over new clothing, and that's become more and more popular because as it offers economical wardrobe options and reduces waste. Now here we've got the word wardrobe that could actually refer to that piece of furniture in your bedroom or in your living room or wherever in which your clothes are contained. I don't know about you in Arizona there, but where I'm from in the U.S., we had closets. We did not have wardrobes.
No, but back east they had to because when they first built those buildings, no one had built-in closets.
Okay.
They didn't exist. So it's frustrating because, and here it's the case too, those wardrobes take up even more space.
They do. But wardrobes, of course, are a common piece of furniture here in Taiwan. But in this particular case, though, it has a different meaning. Your wardrobe is basically all the clothes you have and the kind of styles you have chosen. So you might be saying something like, oh, I need to buy some new clothing for my wardrobe. It's kind of boring. It's outdated. I need to buy some new clothes so I can look my best.
Yeah, and if you use it like that, guys, it's non-count. Don't say, oh, I need to update my wardrobes. Don't put an S on it. But if it's a piece of furniture that Tom was describing, then it is countable. So there you go. I have a couple of different big wardrobes in my apartment. So yeah, that's where I store my clothes. So anyway, yeah, this is a way that some people thought, oh, I can help the world. I can reduce clothing waste. We're buying so many different new pieces of clothing every day, especially for the women, that we're actually coming up with a lot of waste for our planet, which is bad. This trend is highlighted by startling statistics. So here are some startling statistics, numbers. Startling just means shocking, something that you find quite amazing. Wow. If someone startles you, you might jump when you hear their voice. You weren't expecting someone to be in the room with you, and suddenly you hear a voice and you go, oh! They startled you. So why are these statistics, that's hard to say, startling?
Yeah, they are difficult to believe. These are numbers. They're mathematics in terms of how many things are sold and how much money they make. These are the statistics. And, well, the global market value of secondhand clothing surged to around 5.3 trillion NT dollars in 2022, just a couple of years ago, and is projected to double by 2027. So we've got a big market value of secondhand clothing, or the market value of the secondhand clothing trade. And if something surges, it increases suddenly and rapidly, okay? So you got to be careful about electricity surging in your home. So you need to have those, what do they call those special extension cords?
Surge protectors.
Surge protectors, okay? And
Yeah.
they have a breaker circuit or something like that. But in this particular case, the word surge is a verb. It just means it increases suddenly and to a large amount. And of course, this number is quite high here, 5.3 trillion NT dollars, not a million, not a billion, but trillions here. And that again was a couple of years ago. And they're guessing, or they're projecting, or they're predicting that the value of the global used clothing trade will reach a double figure by 2027.
Wow, that's insane. So let's talk about this number trillion. That's actually representing a number that has 12 zeros. It's 1,000 billion. So a trillion is a lot of money. So if you double that, you've got $10.6 trillion. That's a lot of money. It's a big market value that we're saying that the secondhand clothing market will have. So it's continuing to surge, you could say, despite its potential growth. This booming sector confronts or faces distinct challenges in some countries. When you talk about a sector, you're usually talking about some sort of business. You could talk about the real estate sector, financial sector. It's just one part of all of, business that you're talking about, a sector. It's kind of like a section.
Right. Okay. So, yes, even though we have this potential growth, of course, lots of people are thinking about investing in this particular market.
Yeah.
Well, it has some challenges in some countries. There are some problems that we do need to discuss, which we'll get into right now. So let's move on now to the next paragraph. It says, in the UK, in the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, many second-hand clothing businesses struggle to turn a profit. So it does sound like you can make a lot of money selling second-hand clothing, but hey, in the UK, they're having problems making some money. Some of these people who sell used clothing might be thinking of closing up shop and doing something else.
Yeah, notice that phrase, to turn a profit. It's kind of interesting. It's unusual, I think. So it just means to make a profit. So the whole idea of being in business or going into business is making a profit. You don't want your expenses to equal the money that your business makes. Then you don't make any money at all. So to turn a profit's really important, and they're not able to do that in the UK. We're talking about this situation being a paradox. Paradox is kind of a difficult word, I think. I wanted to get some good examples so that I could explain this better. So a paradox is something, and for example, this is a situation we're talking about that's made up of two opposite things that seem impossible to happen at the same time, but they're actually true, or something is actually possible. So for example, it's a paradox that our computers need maintenance so often when they were actually invented to help us save time. So, sometimes you do something because you think it's going to, make your life easier, when it just makes your life more complicated or busier. For example, our phones. Or it could be someone, it could be a person who does two things that seem to be opposite to each other, or who has qualities that are opposite. For example, actors, sometimes it's a paradox that actors love being in the public eye, but they also very much deeply value their own privacy. So they love the attention when they're maybe opening a film and doing that stuff, but they don't want you to notice them when they go to the grocery store.
Right. The example I was taught when I was a kid was, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Okay, it's a paradox. How can you answer that question? You can't have an egg without a chicken, but then you can't have a chicken without an egg. So that's a paradox. And so this is a paradox of these secondhand clothing stores struggling to turn a profit. You might think that they're actually making money, but they're not. And of course, this extends from the excessive supply of garments in the market. Okay, so it extends, or is the result of having too many garments in this market. If you have an excessive supply of something, you have too much of something.
Yeah.
A garment is basically a piece of clothing. It's a fancy word for a shirt or a pair of pants or whatever. Those are garments. And there just are too many of those garments in the market. And also, this paradox stems or comes from costs associated with processing received items. Yeah, you can't just take somebody's used shirt and stick it on the shelf. It's got to be washed, it's got to be prepared, and that takes time and money.
Yeah, I wanted to mention something on this word garments. It's kind of formal. It's a little formal. The only people I ever heard use the word garments were people that were in the fashion industry. It makes them sound like they're really cool. Oh, I love that garment you have there. This garment is made by, Pravda or whoever. Anyway, yeah. So normal people typically just say clothes or clothing, but remember, garments is countable. Garment, you can put an S on it. Clothing, you cannot. So you have to say a piece of clothing or a pair of pants. So be careful with that. This is interesting because if you have high operational costs, as Tom mentioned, it means it costs a lot to even run your business. And you can't just take people's clothes that they've, turned in to be, recycled and just put them out on the shelves. Obviously, that doesn't work. Sometimes people have to go through and see if there's stains on them or things that make them unsellable. So I can see why their operational costs would be expensive. Operational just means ready to use, able to be used. You can put operational in front of a noun. For example, operational costs. If it's used before a noun, though, it relates to the operation of a machine or a business only.
Right. So, of course, it takes a lot of effort. There's lots of things you need to do in order to prepare this clothing for sale. And the abundance of cheap, fast fashion items has led to a cycle where clothing is not taken seriously enough and is discarded quickly with only minimal use before ending up in poor condition at second-hand stores. So this has made the problem worse. My goodness, this is a long sentence. First of all, the next problem we're talking about is the abundance of cheap, fast fashion items. Okay, we've got fast fashion stores nowadays selling cheap but poor quality clothing that people buy because it's cool and you can wear it a couple of times and then you can throw it out.
Oh, for a season. You can wear it for one season, right?
Okay, not just once or twice, maybe more than that. Yeah. But we've got an abundance of this stuff. We've got a lot of it. And, of course, that has people thinking that, well, if clothing's like that, then we don't really need to take clothing too seriously. It's all just really cheap stuff and we can throw it away and we can keep on buying the stuff. So, of course, nowadays we have too much of that stuff. And so, therefore, the clothing is discarded quickly. To discard just means to throw something out.
Yeah. I don't think this is going to continue, though, if our economy doesn't get any better because people are trying to save their money these days. They're not spending like they used to. I'm not either. So, yeah, discard means to get rid of something. I'm trying to discard the extra stuff in my apartment that I don't use. Instead of just keeping everything stored in my little apartment, I'm trying to work at going through and discarding as much as I can. Right now, guys, we are going to take a quick break. We don't have our Chinese teacher. I'm sorry. But we'll be back and we'll continue talking about secondhand clothing and what's happening out there in the world.
Okay, let's continue to talk about reassessing the second-hand clothing trade. Of course, it's very valuable right now. It's going to double by the year 2027, but it does have some problems, and we do need to reassess this particular trade. We're mentioning the example of the UK. Lots of the second-hand clothing stores there are struggling to make money. They can't turn a profit, and that's a paradox. They're getting these cheap clothing items, but they still can't make money. And that's because they have those high operational costs. You get the clothes free or at a very cheap price, but you still have to do something with them. And that stuff costs a lot of money. And then, of course, people aren't taking clothing seriously. They're just discarding their clothes all the time. We've got big piles of clothing that needs to be, handled and it needs to be gone through. So to sort and repair recycled garments means extensive manual labor, which is costly in the UK. You can't just find people in the UK who are going to accept £1 per hour or something like that to work in a factory that processes used clothing. No, they're going to expect a lot of pay, and then there are union dues and things like that. So, of course, it's very expensive to pay for people to process those garments. And in some cases, high labor costs cause the price of secondhand clothing to exceed that of new products, which sounds interesting. Sometimes if your phone has a problem and you take it down to get it repaired, they just look at you and say, it's going to be cheaper if you just buy a new phone instead of having this fixed. And I guess it's kind of similar here with clothing. It actually will end up costing you less to buy new clothes than used clothes.
It's kind of crazy, isn't it? The cost of living is so high in the UK, though, and they have all these regulations that the government has issued. So you can't just hire someone who maybe is starting out. Maybe it's their first job. You have to pay them quite a bit, but it does cost a lot to live there. So I don't begrudge them in the UK for wanting a good salary. But yeah, it's crazy that it would cost more to buy secondhand clothing than that of new products. I wanted to mention, though, for those of you out there that love old clothing, we call it vintage, especially for the ladies out there, vintage clothing. We don't talk about antique clothing.
No.
If you talk about older clothing that's kind of cool even from the 80s, that's vintage, or the 90s, that's vintage. So you don't have to go back 100 years, but vintage clothing is very popular. So if you're looking for something because you want a certain style or you have a certain flair and you have a personality that just loves older looking things or older time or older periods in history, you love their clothes. I do. I love the early 1900s. I love those clothes. That's called vintage clothing, Vintage. And those are special stores that you can find.
Right. And I would like my wife to take a long vacation down to Kending or something like that so I can invite people into our house and go ahead and take all the vintage clothing that their hearts desire.
Oh, she keeps everything.
Yeah, we've got like 500, 1,000, maybe 2,000 items of clothing in the house.
I have too much.
That she just can't part with. Oh, I've got to keep that. You never know when we're going to need it. But in any case, back to the topic here. Yes, it's more expensive to sell used clothing than it would be to actually sell new clothing.
It's crazy.
Because of labor costs and things like that. Now, moving on now to the next paragraph here. It says, some developing countries, such as Uganda and Indonesia, face both positives and negatives in the secondhand clothing trade. So basically, this sentence says, secondhand clothing is good and bad for countries like Uganda and Indonesia.
Yeah, at the same time. But I feel, though, Tom, a lot of the first world countries want to get rid of their trash,
right,
what they consider, trash. So they ship it off to some of these poorer countries, which is unfair. But what they're trying to do in Uganda and Indonesia is use the clothing that comes to them to help generate or produce, that's what generate means, jobs. They want jobs for the people that live there. Retail means you're selling something. Transportation, you're driving a truck, or you're on a ship where things are being shipped from one place to another. But it says in these countries it also caters to the basic clothing needs of the economically disadvantaged. What they're talking about is people that don't have a lot of money, the poor. But if you cater to something, we usually use cater to talk about providing food and drink at a party. You hire a catering service, but here it means you provide somebody with something they want or need that's very particular. They have a specific desire that they want. Well, it caters to the basic clothing needs. So people who can't afford to buy a pair of pants and a T-shirt now have access to those things.
Right. So we think of countries like Uganda and Indonesia as being relatively poor. So we think we're doing them a favor by sending them used clothing. But their economies are getting better and better all the time.
Yeah.
And, of course, yes, it's good for them. You can get a job there, processing the clothing. You can drive them around and deliver them and stuff like that. And it's estimated that about 1/3 of Uganda's population depends on these affordable alternatives. So, yes, indeed, lots of people in Uganda depend on used clothing instead of buying new clothing. So it's good in that regard.
That is good. Nevertheless, even though that's true, this trade, this secondhand clothing trade, also hampers the growth of local textile industries. To hamper something means you're kind of slowing the movement of something or the progress of something. You're making it tough for something to continue. For example, you could say, bad weather is hampering the rescue efforts of the police. or maybe we had an earthquake, and bad weather is hampering the efforts of recovering people who are trapped. Or maybe you could say road construction is hampering traffic. It's slowing traffic down. So yeah, this trade is hampering the growth. Or, a lot of businesses there, they want their own businesses to be established. They don't want to have to keep using stuff that we send over, right? So they want their own local textile industries. What's textile, Tom?
It has to do with clothing or with cloth specifically. So textiles can be used to make clothing, but it can also be used to make things like curtains or other kinds of cloth, quilts for beds, sheets, or whatever. And yeah, those people are not idiots in those countries. They do know how to make clothing, and they have their own clothing industry. So if you keep sending them all these used clothing items, then it hurts those local industries. And then that leads to government proposals in both Uganda and Indonesia to ban imports of used clothing. So you might think, hey, you people are being ungrateful for not accepting our donations. But hey, we don't need all this used clothing because we'd like to develop our own textile industries. So yes, they've got these proposals in these two countries, Uganda and Indonesia. Some of them want to ban the imports of used clothing. We don't want those clothing items anymore. We're perfectly able to make our own clothing at a cheaper price.
Yeah, so to ban means to forbid something from happening. Look at this, though. They're only banning imports. So used clothing from other countries is banned, while secondhand garments or clothes from domestic sources remain allowed. These legislative efforts have been met with strong opposition and challenges in implementation. Domestic sources means from the country you're talking about. So they've got secondhand clothing in their own countries already from their own citizens. So they just want to ban the garbage that other countries are sending over to them. They're trying to pass laws. When you see this word legislative, you know that they have some sort of parliament or legislative yuan, as we say here, that has tried to protect their own countries and the citizens. But what they've tried to do with these laws have been met or been confronted with or faced strong opposition and challenges in implementation. If you implement something, you put it into practice, you put it into effect, so that it's actually a process that's working.
Right. So as you said, to implement is the verb, to put something into action, like the government is trying to implement a new policy for the economy. And then implementation, of course, is the noun form. The government is having problems with the implementation of the new law. Some people like it, some people don't. And that's what's happening in these countries, and I'm sure in other countries around the world. You've got some people who support the idea of banning imports of used clothing, and then some people are actually against that idea. No, we need those clothing items because we can't properly clothe our population. They're going to be cold during the winter and times like that. So yes, indeed, they've got these challenges in implementation, and so it's still kind of controversial in those places.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. It's controversial. So moving on to the final paragraph, it says, these examples that we've just given you from the UK and Uganda and Indonesia, they illustrate or show, they point out, they give us a way to look at this problem. And it shows that easy access, getting your hands on secondhand clothing, can sometimes have complex effects on a society and its economy. Complex just means complicated. It's not simple. It's not straightforward. There are a lot of things that you have to consider. And we're just finding out, if you just hear secondhand clothing, you think, oh, that's great. We can recycle. We don't have to, waste so much or try to burn the old clothes because, that's not good for your environment, or bury them. That's not good either. We're polluting our poor earth. You're going to find out it's not that easy. It's not that simple. It's complicated.
Right, and while used clothing might seem like an obvious solution to excessive garment waste, the reality is that it's a complicated issue that requires careful thought. So this is the final paragraph. It sort of sums up this problem here. These examples tell us or illustrate or show us that easily getting to secondhand clothing can have complex, complicated effects on society and on the economy. It's not an easy issue. It sounds easy. Let's sell those used clothing items and make a lot of money. No, it's not that simple. And yes, some people might think it's an obvious solution, but it's still very complicated, and we all need to think about it carefully. I'm not sure if this is a problem for me because, as you know, Stephanie, I pretty much wear the same clothes that I've worn for the past 10 or 20 years.
They last a long time, which is great.
They do, and I don't really care what I look like. I usually wear solid colors, and I just change the colors once in a while. But for me, it's quite simple. I don't really care. But for some people, it's a big problem, and they need to change their wardrobes every season.
I'm curious to know if Taiwan has this problem. Do they have too much in terms of clothing that that gets recycled? I don't know. But it's something to look into. I know that I am no longer buying clothes every season like I used to. So I'm trying to change my ways too. Well, we hope you enjoyed hearing more about this issue. It's something that I think is going to continue to cause some trouble for us around the world. And we hope that you learn some new words that you can put into practice, you can implement, right? So we hope you'll join us for our next program. And in the meantime, check out our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, learn some more, and give us a thumbs up or a like. For English Digest, I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Tom. Goodbye.
Bye.